This presentation today is brought to you by Baltimore Green Space. Baltimore Green Space is a community land trust that works with community managed green spaces to help protect them and help empower them for great success. We work with a variety of green spaces, from pocket parks to open spaces to community gardens to forests. We're here as part of the Forest Stewardship Program. With the Forest Stewardship Program, we work with neighbors that care for local forest patches. We provide them resources to develop their skills and knowledge so that they can better care for their forests. And we coordinate the Forest Stewardship Network, which builds connections between forest leaders, expert scientists, and nonprofit leaders so that we can all work better in collaboration. As part of the Forest Stewardship Program, we host regular events, from things like forest maintenance and cleanup days, where we clean up trash or remove vines that are harming the health of the forest, to educational events where we have plant ID walks or bird walks, to community meetings where we can help increase collaboration between community leaders, forest stewards, and scientists. And we host scientist presentations such as this one, where we can learn a little bit more about the science that is happening here in Baltimore and get a little bit more connected with all the cool things that are happening. As part of that, we also connect scientists to local green spaces and community leaders, so that not only the community leaders can better understand what is happening in their forest or in their green space, but also so that we as a scientific community can help better understand how Baltimore is functioning as an ecosystem, both at the greater scale and at the super specific scale. With that, thank you for hearing a little bit about Baltimore Green Space. If you want to get involved, either to help coordinate working with scientists, or if you have a green space you want to get involved in the community network, please reach out to either me with the information here, or to Patrick at the information down below. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Ela. So Ela is a urban wildlife biologist at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she is going to tell us a little bit about the research she has done and the research she is doing around Baltimore. So Ela, why don't you take it over?
All right, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Awesome. My camera just decided to act funny at the very last minute, but we should still be able to share my screen. All right, can you see that?
Yep, it is up and running.
Awesome. All right, thanks so much for having me, Eric, and I'm really glad to be here early afternoon to talk a little bit about my work studying urban wildlife, especially here in Baltimore these past several years. And so this is just kind of a general outline of what I'll be talking about today. I'll give a brief background about the field of urban wildlife research, some different types of studies that kind of highlight the types of things we learn in cities, as well as some of the work that I have done. And then I'll wrap up by talking about the different ways that we can support wildlife around us. So I wanted to try to make this a little bit interactive as much as possible. So I won't be able to see the chat, but Eric, if you see anything, please let me know. So one of the first things I wanted to ask folks was, what kind of images come to mind when you think of the term urban wildlife? And if you want, you can just type it in the chat. I'll give you a few seconds to do that.
Looks like we have someone saying deer.
Okay.
Groundhogs and foxes.
Mm-hmm.
Raccoons, hawks, foxes.
Nice.
Some interesting language around deer, raccoons, and opossums.
Okay. So I pulled that image up on Google to kind of see.
Oh, and cats.
What their algorithm kind of thinks of when they when we think about urban wildlife. And so a lot of times, like raccoons are one of the things that comes to mind. Foxes, squirrels. There's a picture at the bottom of deer hanging out at a golf course, it looks like. So kind of the animals that we're used to seeing around us, and sometimes that is in a not so pleasant manner. But to me, urban wildlife is so much more than just like the pigeons and the rats and the raccoons. And like a lot of you said, you gave some great examples. It can be things like unexpected, like this first picture of downtown Austin, which was a very famous bridge that many years ago, a very big colony of bats moved into. And it wasn't designed for that, but it became their home, and people over time were able to change their mindset of, disgust and not wanting them there to now it's a beloved tourist attraction in downtown Austin to hang out on the bridge at sunset and watch the bats emerge. It can be things that we see in a big green space, like you see at Masonville Cove, the bottom left, or other large urban parks. It can be things that you see in small spaces like a vacant lot, or even just sitting or looking out your window and having a little bird feeder there, even if you have no front or backyard. It can be traditional bird watching. It can be fishing at a pier. It can just be sitting on your front stoop and just paying attention to the world around you. So there's so many different ways to think about urban wildlife. And so when I first started becoming involved with urban wildlife work, once upon a time, I know that some people weren't always sure about why it's important to do that. A lot of times we think of cities or urbanization as a cause of wildlife decline, and that it's a negative thing. And also people ask, why would I even want to stay in the city to study wildlife? Why wouldn't I want to go to a rainforest or a desert or something like that? And for me, it just seemed like a very relevant and timely field to be involved in. And over time, more and more people are living in cities. And also during the same time, more and more wildlife are becoming a bit more habituated to being in urban spaces. And so there's a lot more interactions between people and wildlife occurring. And so it's really important to understand the reason behind this and how wildlife is navigating the city. Also, for researchers like myself who are also interested in outreach, it's a fantastic place to really connect the work that we do with its relevance around us in cities. It's also what you call kind of a new field of study. When you think about a lot of older studies, like stuff that Charles Darwin did, that happened many, many centuries ago, and maybe just since the 1990s, a lot of urban wildlife research has started picking up just since then. And it's a really interesting field, I think, because it's very intersectional. There's social science components to it. It has relevancy for urban planning, environmental justice, landscape architecture, and things like that. And so it has a lot of importance, not just within its own field, but a lot of these adjacent fields. And so I always like to highlight the different spaces in which urban wildlife research occurs. We might just think that parks or forests are the best places to do that kind of work, but it can be literally anything. I'm pretty sure I've seen research studies that focus on each of these different categories here, where some folks focus on just people's backyards and what's there, golf courses, cemeteries, waterways, basically any place in the city can be the location of urban wildlife research. I'll just pause there for a moment before I go to the next section. Are there any questions? Okay, sounds like there's no questions, so I'll go ahead to the next section. And this is just kind of a general overview of different types of research findings that have been found in cities. Definitely not all inclusive. There probably could be a dozen more categories that I could put here, but I just wanted to highlight a few of the ones that I think are particularly interesting. So the first one really just focuses on how we impact wildlife and nature around us in the city. A lot of times this is done by researchers looking at what we call socioeconomic variables in urban spaces. And we can impact wildlife in one of two manners. There are bottom-up impacts and top-down impacts. And bottom-up is kind of when we measure data at the individual household scale. And so looking at things like income, education, ethnicity, and things like that. Common phenomenon that's been studied in urban ecology research is the luxury effect, which states that neighborhoods that are higher income areas tend to have higher biodiversity in those areas. On the flip side of that is what we call top down, and that's when like a city government or an organization makes decisions that has impacts over broad reaches of an urban space. And so when we think about, for example, the city government and how often they plant trees, when and where they plant it, how often they decide to mow the grass in their parks, those kind of decisions impact a broad scale of wildlife within the city. And it can also happen from, I guess, non-green methods. So even things that happened in the past, like segregation and redlining, will impact where people are nowadays. And in turn, that affects what kind of wildlife is around us. And so I always like to highlight this example from a paper from South Africa, because it shows a little bit of both of those impacts and how plant distribution or the plant biodiversity of a small town in South Africa. And so these researchers were looking at the different types of neighborhoods in a town in South Africa. As some of you probably already know, apartheid was a major part of South African history in the past. And even though it's not a thing anymore there, a lot of these neighborhoods still have similar segregation patterns. And so these researchers went to different neighborhoods and did surveys of the types of plants there. And they found several different things. And what I'll just show really quickly with the pictures is that in A, that is from the Botswana tribe that lives in the area. That's a cultural concept of what an ideal yard would look like, and they call it the Labala concept. And so it's supposed to reflect the outside of the house looks very clean, and it's supposed to reflect how the inside of the house looks. And you can see there's a little bit of vegetation in the back, but you can see in B, C, and D kind of similar Labala concept seen here. And as you go from B to F, these are neighborhoods increasing in income levels. So F is the wealthiest one, B is the lowest income. And what they found was that, of course, the higher income neighborhoods, E and F, had more plant species, but they also looked at the types of plants that were there. And when they looked at that, they saw that they had a lot of non-native species of plants, and a lot of the plants were there kind of as ornamental. So they were there for landscaping and to look pretty in those neighborhoods. But in the lower income neighborhoods, even though there was less biodiversity of plants, what they found was a lot of the plants that were there were being used for some reason. They were used for medicinal purposes, or they were planting fruits and vegetables for sustenance. And so it kind of shows all these different impacts, both from segregation in the past to what our cultural beliefs are, to how much money we can afford to spend on our yards. And it shows all these different ways in which we affect the type of nature that's around us. And in turn, whatever plants are around are going to impact the types of insects and herbivores. And then, of course, that affects the types of carnivores and omnivores and things like that that are there. And so those last couple slides talked about the ways that we impact wildlife, but wildlife's presence can also impact us. And sometimes that's looked at through an environmental justice lens. And so the disproportionate presence or absence of wildlife, either beneficial or harmful, can in turn be good or bad for us. This is an example from some local work. Shannon Ladeau studies mosquitoes throughout Baltimore, and she's been focusing on an invasive species of mosquito. And a lot of her studies compare the population and density and the types of hosts in low income and high income areas. And some of the things that she's found is that lower income areas tend to have more of these mosquitoes. They tend to be bigger. There tends to be higher population density of these mosquitoes. And so when it's this type of mosquito is one that comes out during the day instead of just at dawn or dusk. And so this is something that impacts people throughout the day and can result in them not spending as much time outside. And so another thing a lot of people don't think about when they think of urban wildlife is discovering these species. We tend to hear big news stories about new wildlife being found in faraway jungles and things like that. But there have been studies and surveys in urban spaces where people end up finding brand new species, literally in our backyards. And sometimes these are just researchers who notice that one frog in their backyard sounds a little bit different from the others and then discovering it was a different species. And sometimes this happens through citizen science work where people are just participating in a study and they're finding 30 some different species of flies in their backyard that have never been documented as science before. And sometimes these discoveries end up happening inside of our homes as well. Rob Dunn is a researcher who does a lot of work with more so microorganisms, but also some wildlife and insects that are found inside of people's houses and studying that kind of urban ecology. And so this book that he wrote highlights how all these different species of fungi have been documented inside of our houses that haven't been documented outside. And one study he did with camel crickets, just asking people to send him ones that they found in their house. They're those kind of big, kind of scary looking crickets that hang out in basements. And he discovered that some of them were an invasive species that came from Asia. And no one really knows how it got there, but it's a discovery that wouldn't have been made if we hadn't started actually like literally looking within, like at our own houses. And so studies on animal movement and diet happen in both rural and urban spaces, but looking at it in cities can help us understand how some wildlife, especially some of the larger species, are able to navigate through urban spaces, what they're eating, how they're getting it. And that can potentially inform us of, placement of wildlife crossings and things like that, and finding ways to mitigate vehicle collisions. And so this is a very famous example in this top photo of a mountain lion in California. So out there, mountain lions are one of their urban wildlife species. And so there's been ongoing work just documenting where these mountain lions are traveling with these collars. And so a very famous individual is here. He's called P22. And so scientists have been able to document what he's eating to get by in a very small fragment of a forest over there. And I've also seen some of the perils that comes with living in urban spaces, especially for these bigger species. So some individuals have gotten hit by cars. P22 is somehow able to survive mange, which is a pretty nasty infection, and also occasional rodenticide poisoning. So when people put out rodent poison, that ends up killing the rodents, and then predators like this mountain lion will eat it and then in turn get sick. And so they've been able to document like a full life history of mountain lions out there, which is pretty cool. This is just a quick highlight from a study in Chicago looking at coyote. Basically, these researchers looked at scat in different locations in Chicago, which are these different colors, and wanted to look at what kind of things the coyotes were eating and how that changed over the year. And so you can see coyotes are omnivores, so they're eating meat, fruit, and also human food. And so this is really important for certain populations. You can see this white one here during pup ring and dispersal seasons, which is basically spring to fall. there's a big increase in, or at least within that population, there tends to be a lot of human associated food. And so this can be really relevant and important to people who live around these coyotes and learning about what times of year they may be more likely to show up in the neighborhoods looking for food. And so I had quite as exciting as coyotes and mountain lions yet, but I'll just briefly talk about some of the work that I've done here in Baltimore. This all started back in 2013 for me when I started helping with the Baltimore ecosystem study. And one of the first projects I worked on was helping with long-term bird surveys. This shows a map of Baltimore City, and all the dots are places that we went to do 5-minute point count surveys. And that's basically just kind of a snapshot survey, seeing what's in the area. And we would listen to and see birds, and for 5 minutes, we would count everything that we saw and heard during that time. And this was part of long-term data. And so this was research that had started back in, I think, 2004, all the way up to 2018. And during that time, me and other researchers found about 30,000 observations of birds, and it was close to 100 species that we documented. And all of these points weren't necessarily at green spaces. Some of these were just at intersections or in front of small vacant lots and things like that. And so they are located in lots of different spaces in the city. I also assisted a friend with her work, looking at how birds use vacant lots in Baltimore. Again, these are super small parcels, as many of you know, and we did mist netting and some banding, but primarily did surveys and looked at monitoring nests that were located on these vacant lots to see how many species were present, how many were using these vacant lots, and what kind of variables in these vacant lots seem to be helpful for nesting species of birds. And my friend Christine found 60 species of birds using vacant lots. And some of the most important variables for successful nesting at these vacant lots included the presence of shrubs, as well as the presence of nearby green spaces or forest near these vacant lots. And so during this time, I also got interested in doing a bit more research, and that's when I decided to go back to school and kind of integrate what I had learned from the bird research, but looking at bats as a focal species instead. So it was pretty similar, where I was looking at bats that were using vacant lots and looking for certain characteristics to see if certain vacant lots were being visited more often by bats and why that might be. And so I did that using a technique called acoustic monitoring. And in this picture, you can see on the side, there's this funny looking metal box tied to a tree. And that's what we call an acoustic device or a bat detector. And so what I would do is go around to these different vacant lots, tie this to a tree, and any bats that were in the area and or using echolocation, this device would record it and store it on there. And what I would get a few days later when I came back would be lots and lots of little files that look like this. And similar to birds, bats can also be identified by the types of sounds that they make to species level. And so in this graph, you see there's 2 different calls here. And from past research, we know that these really steep calls that drop down to about 25 kilohertz comes from a big brown bat, which is a very common species throughout North America. And it's a pretty common urban species of bat. Whereas you also see a shallower set of calls that are around 16 to 18 kilohertz. And from past research, we know that that comes from a hoary bat, which is the largest bat in the state of Maryland. Unfortunately, not as common of an urban species as the big brown bat. And so I did this at 32 sites or 32 vacant lots in Baltimore over the course of 2 years. And we found 6 species of bats that were hanging out in Baltimore City. And that's about half the number of species present in the state of Maryland. Again, big brown bats were the most common one, very common urban bat species, so that wasn't really surprising. Some of the other common ones included red bats, silver-haired, and evening bats as well. And we also had some less common species show up, which included the hoary bat and the tricolor bat, which unfortunately has had a severe population loss recently. Some of you may have heard about white nose syndrome, and it's a fungal disease that kills bats while they're hibernating in caves. And unfortunately, the tricolor bat has been hit really bad by that disease. And so unfortunately, we did not get a lot of recordings from that bat. So I also wanted to look at the vacant lots themselves and look at what kind of variables were associated with lots that had more bat activity there. And so I did this for both environmental and more human-based variables. And some of the variables that stood out were vacant lots that were closer to water. For some species, the amount of rows surrounding the vacant lot was a deterrent. And also things like the amount of canopy cover, both at the vacant lot and in the nearby surroundings. To get socioeconomic data, I basically used the US Census data and looked at census tracts where these lots were located and gathered data from that. And some of the variables that stood out when it came to that was income. So again, highlighting the luxury effect that we talked about earlier. Also, census tracts that had a lot of older housing or a lot of vacant housing were associated with more calls from certain species, as well as race. And so some neighborhoods had higher African-American populations, and certain bat species were seen there more often. And the inverse was also true in some areas. Less Black population was present, and some species were seen there more often. And so now I'm going to shift to some of my current work. For those of you familiar with Baltimore City, this is South Baltimore right here. This is 895 along the bottom. The neighborhoods of Curtis Bay and Brooklyn are down here. And Masonville came to be from about a little over a decade ago when the Maryland Port Administration wanted to build a dredge facility. And basically what that means is in order to keep the shipping channels clear so that these big boats can come in and out, the sediment from the bottom of these waterways needs to be dredged up and stored somewhere so these boats can get in and out easily. And in order for them to create that, they have to also provide some sort of environmental restoration project. And when they talked to people in the nearby areas, one of the things that they mentioned that they wanted was access to the water again. And that was not possible at the time because this area had basically become an industrial dumping ground. And it was just tons and tons of stuff there. And so they ended up restoring this land, and they took over 61,000 tons of trash. And this included not even like typical litter and dumping, but there were abandoned ships and building debris and even some debris from, I think, the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904 was pulled up from there. So tons of trash was taken out. The top layer of the soil was polluted, and so they removed that and capped it and put a layer of clean soil on top. And then they did a lot of restoration activities. So there were trees planted, wetland plants placed along the edges of the water to create a living shoreline. And I think about 200 or 300 reef balls were placed inside of this cove. And that was a little over a decade ago. And so this is a little snapshot of what Masonville looks like nowadays. Over 250 species of birds have been documented here. And so one of my main roles here has been working on the wildlife management plan. And so when the Maryland Port Administration was working on this land and helping get it restored, they wanted to document what species were there and kind of monitor their populations to see if things would increase or decrease or stay the same. And so one of the main things that I do a couple times a year is do trail camera surveys to assess the type of mammals that are present at Masonville. And that includes this pair of coyotes that recently started hanging out here earlier this year. We're also one of the first places in Baltimore City to have a pair of bald eagles return to nesting within city limits. And so we monitor the eagles there. There's also infrared deer surveys that I do where we count the number of deer that are at Masonville to monitor their population levels. And earlier this autumn, we also participated in monarch tagging, putting these little tiny stickers on monarchs as they make their way down to Mexico. Kind of shows some of the past research that was done with these mammals at Masonville with the trail surveys. This monitoring has been happening since about 2014. And it's a very informal manner of monitoring. It's not like population density numbers or anything like that. This basically means on an average night, if you were to put a trail camera out anywhere in Masonville Cove, you would have on average X number of these species. And so you can see over time, for example, with red foxes, the likelihood of seeing them has gone up and down. This year when I started, the amount of coyotes just suddenly skyrocketed kind of out of nowhere, it seemed like. In the past, we had very few sightings, and then suddenly this year we had at least a pair of them visiting pretty regularly. And so it's been exciting to look at this past data and also kind of see what happens with these coyotes that have been visiting a bit more often. Another project that I've been doing at Masonville actually is not really related to any urban species, but it is done at Masonville. And that is a greenhouse project where I've been planting false blue indigo. And this plant is one of 2 or 3 host plants that are used by an at-risk species of butterfly called the frosted elfin. And so the goal is to grow these plants and eventually plant them in other parts of the state where there are still populations of this at-risk butterfly parasite. I'm really fortunate that as part of my work, I also am involved with outreach and programming and not just wildlife research. And so I've been very happy to be involved with presentations like this and programs at Masonville and Patuxent and planning for additional projects in the future, one of which I'm really excited about is having a bird banding station there, hopefully next year. And I'll just pause there for 1 minute to see if anyone has any questions before I go to the last part.
We did have one question, and it was, how are birds using vacant lots? Are they nesting? Are they feeding? What?
Yeah, so a little bit of everything. So we monitored, I want to say a handful of species that were nesting there pretty often, and that included American robins, gray catbirds, mockingbirds. I feel like those were probably the most common species that we saw actually nesting vacant lots, northern cardinals as well. And a lot of the other times when we were doing those surveys, sometimes it would just be birds flying over. Sometimes it was bird species that were actually foraging or perched in trees at the site as well. And so that was a bit more varied, but in terms of nesting, it was probably a handful of bird species actually living there in those vacant lots. Okay, so I'll go ahead and go to the last section now. So a lot of times when I do these presentations, I feel like the most common questions that I get afterwards, people asking like, what can we do to help support urban wildlife? Because it's always nice to hear about research and what other people are doing, but it's always really encouraging to see that people are interested in wanting to play their part and see how they can help wildlife. And so one of the things we do have to be mindful of is that sometimes we can have good intentions, but end up actually harming wildlife. And so I just put some different pictures here. And this is another opportunity to post things in the chat. Let me know which of these activities you think are helpful to wildlife or harmful, or maybe some are neutral, or maybe some it depends on. And so I'll just describe the pictures that are here. We have a big bird feeding station, a bluebird box. We have a little wildlife feeding station for raccoons and some outdoor cats. We have plants in small pots. We have I think that's a rat baiting station. And then we have a window that's been cleaned very, very nicely so you can see the reflection of the trees outside.
It looks like we got folks saying that feeding cats is harmful. The bluebird box is helpful if you keep the house sparrows out. And other folks saying to not feed the wildlife, leave the wildlife wild.
There you go. All right, well, that sounds like a pretty good, pretty correct. And so one of the main things that we can do to be helpful is creating habitat. And this is a resource from the Pollinator Partnership that Fish and Wildlife is a part of. And it kind of describes an ideal pollinator garden and the types of plants that can go in there to support multiple types of pollinators throughout the year. And so the thing with helping wildlife is it can be as big or small as you want. It could be planting a 3x6 garden bed of pollinators, or it can just be, if you just can afford a small pot, just putting some echinacea or something like that in there, or some coneflowers, and just having that outside your front door. There's just really so many different types of things we can do, and every little bit helps, I think. And that includes with trees and shrubs, and even having leaf piles or stick piles or things like that. Even those are a bit messier looking. Those types of things are also really helpful for wildlife as well. You can also provide human-made houses for wildlife. That can include things like this bat house that you see up here. And there's just so much variety in the types of bird houses that you can have. Obviously, traditional ones like this for bluebirds, but there's specialized ones if you want to attract owls or kestrels. And you can even make what they call chimney swift towers. And that's basically a wooden version of a chimney. And you can create one of those to try to attract chimney swifts to your area. And of course, there's specialized houses for bats and things for native bees and toads and amphibians and reptiles as well. Bird feeders and bird baths can also be helpful, but in order for them to be helpful, they have to be cleaned and maintained very often. Otherwise, they can actually be harmful. There was a incident earlier this year where a lot of birds seemed to be getting sick, and no one was really sure what was happening. But as a precaution, they asked people to take down bird feeders because it's kind of like how we're dealing with COVID now, where anything that draws a lot of wildlife to one spot has the potential to spread disease to each other. So it's really important that we keep those kind of spaces clean and maintained regularly. You can also get involved with a citizen or community science project. This picture on the bottom shows the image from iNaturalist, which is a very popular app and website, and just simply taking a picture of something you see on your phone and posting it to the app or the website adds more data to what's around us. And it's also a great learning tool if you're just curious about what kind of wildlife is around you that other folks have spotted. I think it's a really cool tool to check out. And there's a lot of different kinds as well. There's eBird, there's ones that focus on specifically what birds come to your feeder or what bird family is living in the bird box that you put up. So lots of variety. SciStarter also has a lot of different types of projects listed there. It's kind of like the Google of community or citizen science. And you can also attend or set up a BioBlitz where you just have everyone go out and identify as much stuff as possible. And Masonville has a BioBlitz every summer. And we also helped Gwynns Falls Leakin Park with their BioBlitz back in October as well. And as much as possible, we want to limit hazards. And sometimes that's in our control and sometimes it's not, and that's okay. So we had that very shiny window earlier, and that is something that can impact a lot of birds. And so placing stickers or dots or something in a window to limit bird collisions can be helpful. Sometimes we aren't always in control of outdoor cats, but when we can, it's great to keep them indoors as much as possible. This is my little friend right here, Lady Khaleesi, and she was a semi-feral cat that showed up to our house 8 years ago and adopted us. And so even though I wanted her to be an indoor cat as much as possible, she made it very clear she wanted to be outside sometimes. And so our compromise was for her to be only outside with someone out there with her, or to have a harness on her when she was outside so she could explore and sniff and come back inside. Also limiting a lot of the other things that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Anytime you have pesticides or rodent bait outside, you can't really control what does and doesn't use that. And so it'll affect anything outside and not just what you're hoping to target. We can also be mindful of litter and trash. A lot of times negative wildlife interactions happen when they show up in our house unexpected. And so making sure our homes are sealed as much as possible to limit unexpected guests. Of course, usual things like driving safely when you're around green spaces to avoid vehicle collisions. And as many of you pointed out earlier, only feeding birds, not feeding raccoons and things like that, that'll bring a little too much attention to your yard and potentially pose a safety hazard. And that's pretty much it for me. I just wanted to highlight a couple of resources. The Migratory Bird Program at Fish and Wildlife has a lot of great resources about especially helping birds in your backyard. And so there's information on types of bird feeders, types of bird houses. If you want to work on limiting window collisions and things like that, they have a lot of great resources there as well. And one of our local partners that does a lot of that work as well is Lights Out Baltimore. And they also are a very great resource for finding ways to support birds in urban spaces and limiting window collisions and light pollution and all that good stuff. And with that, I will thank you all for listening. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
So we got a couple of questions in the chat already. One thing I think that could use clarifying is why it is okay to feed birds and not other wildlife.
Ooh, that is a tough one. And if you want to jump in with anything, Eric, please let me know. My understanding is that there are some people who are not big fans of feeding birds. My general understanding is that they don't become reliant on it the same way other wildlife does. And so if you have it out for a while and you take it away, they'll go do other things. They're less likely to interact with us directly. And other things that I've heard are that birds really don't need to be fed during the summer. They're a lot more reliant on insects and things like that during that time of year. And so feeding is not really essential for them. It's something that I think a lot of folks prefer to do during the winter. But again, there's different opinions on it. Some people support it. Some people are against it. So I myself haven't heard a very specific reason for why birds are okay, but not other insects or other mammals.
Yeah, and just to expand on that, it is hard to get insects or birds to habituate on people. So like, even when you have bird feeders, the birds fly away when you pop outside. There are also diverse ways to feed birds. So as Ela was stating, during the breeding season, birds absolutely need that insect protein. And I know some super big bird enthusiasts switch to mealworms during that time of year and other types of feeding. But again, it is about the like general lack of habituation and harm that comes from it, as long as you keep your bird feeders clean. That being said, there are instances where feeding birds can be detrimental. Some individual things that come to mind are feeding owls and raptors, because they can start habituating. And also sometimes you have things like Florida scrub jays or titmice out in the west, that titmice and chickadees that can start habituating to people, and so it is discouraged in certain circumstances, but a general backyard feeder isn't necessarily one of those types of ways that it's discouraged, because as long as you keep it clean, you're not really doing any harm, and you are supplementing their food resources to help keep them healthier, populations healthier overall. We do have another question that you might know the answer to, but if not, I can step in for, which is, did anybody figure out what was happening to the illness that popped up with the birds over the summer?
Yeah, I feel like the last time I heard about it, they were still doing some research, but it wasn't very clear. And I know one hypothesis was the brood egg cicadas emerged, and that maybe there was like pollution or something in them that had been concentrated and they were eating that. But it sounded like it wasn't very clear at that time. And there were a couple of hypotheses floating around, but that was last that I heard about it. Just kind of suddenly stopped after a while.
Yep, that's about
so yeah, if you have anything to add to that, Eric. Yep.
Yeah, that's so yeah, some of my colleagues over at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Station were looking into that, and no clear conclusions have been made yet, but the best guess so far, which I want to emphasize is still just a guess, was that it was bioaccumulation of pesticides and herbicides that accumulated in the cicadas over 17 years, because the disease pretty much came and went very directly with the cicadas. So it seems likely, but we still do not know. We have another question saying, is there any monitoring of deer populations in the city? Numbers, areas of congregation, things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as I'm aware, I only know of the monitoring we do at Masonville Cove. I know other areas are interested in monitoring them. I know especially in the Gwynns Falls Lincoln Park. I also volunteer there in my free time, and so I know that we have quite a big deer population there, but I know folks are interested in getting more concrete numbers on it, especially at Lincoln Park, but I haven't heard of any other monitoring programs for deer in the city, but I think that would be a really great idea to have that.
Yeah, there's also a scientist named Colin Studds at UMBC who is doing camera trap monitoring at small forest patches around the city. And yeah, we are working on helping that data become a little bit more accessible to the public. So hopefully in the near future, that it's not just deer for that project, but deer do get caught a lot on camera traps. So there are things that are being done studying deer at a larger scale in terms of citywide, but also smaller scale in terms of the types of green spaces that are being looked at. We got one great question saying, can we visit Masonville Cove?
Yes, absolutely. I will put the link to the website in the chat. We'll say if you want to visit the full campus, you should probably come visit in the next week or so, because around the middle of December, because we have eagles that are nesting there or will be nesting there soon, we're required to restrict access to the part of the campus that they're on. And so starting in the next week or so, there'll be less of Masonville Cove to visit, but we still have several trails that are available year round. And I'll go ahead and post a link to the website.
All right. We also have a couple of more you direct questions, which I'll post in the same question. What is the next big focus or project you're excited to work on? And what is the most unique species that you have spotted?
Ooh, gosh, I feel like there's so many projects. Wait, I'm sorry. I feel like I missed the first part. Was it what kind of projects I'm
Yeah, the next most exciting project you got coming up.
Oh, it's the definitely the setting up the bird banding station at Masonville, which I'm very, very excited about. It's something I haven't had a chance to do in a while, and it'll be open to the public so people can come and also get a chance to see birds up close. And so I'm really excited about that. And
can you
we're just
a little bit about
on,
what bird banding is?
Sure. You should probably answer that question. It's ways that we document what kind of species are visiting Masonville, and we're focusing on the migratory part of the year. So from about August to November, a lot of birds will travel through the area from further north as they're heading south. And we put up these big mist nets that we can capture them in, and we can document the species are there and place bands on them. And if someone recites those birds in a different location, then we now have information about how far that bird has traveled or possibly how old that bird is. And so it provides information on how far they're traveling and potentially how long those individuals have been around.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. Next question is, what is the most unique species that you have spotted?
Ooh, at Masonville. I feel like it's a lot of different ones. I mean, I know before I started this job, and I just started earlier this year at Masonville, I had heard people talking about coyotes being seen here and there in the city, but I hadn't seen anything documented anywhere, like no photos or anything. So like literally the second day of my job, I was helping with these trail camera surveys, and we spotted a pair of them. And so it was really cool for me to see like these very healthy looking coyotes just kind of hanging out at Masonville. But I feel like honestly, every day that I'm there, I see something that I'm not always expecting. I know earlier this year we had a tricolored heron, which is not very common for our area. And it was just literally hanging out by the bridge that's right next to one of the trails. And I know a lot of birders have been coming there recently for, I think, Nelson sparrow or some other not very common sparrow. And so a lot of birders like coming there too to check out birds. So probably the birds and just learning all the bird species again, because it's been a minute.
Just says very cool stuff. Thanks for sharing your research. I want to thank you all so much for joining for this spectacular scientist event. I'm going to put my email in the chat. So if anybody wants to reach out to me to connect about really anything green space science in urban areas related, please feel free to reach out. And thank you all so much for coming.